Hey woodworkers, so today we're going to build, you guessed it, another jig. I don't know what's going on. I think I just got into like the jig mindset. No, what it really is, before I start a new type of project, I like to have all the tools required to do so. I don't really like to pause a project because I need a jig or a tool and then go for it if I can help it, right? And so I've done lots of research, and as you all know, our next big project, which should be hopefully the next video or two, will be making our first cutting board. And so you saw me make the crosscut sled, you saw me make the juice groove jig, I still can't say it right, and now we're gonna make a thin strip jig. So I don't actually think I'm gonna use this one right off the bat, which is funny now that I've kind of picked a design for the first cutting board in my head, but this is still a really useful jig, and since I'm kind of making jigs right now, I just thought I'd go ahead and make it. So this is the simplest of all the jigs we've made so far. Again, I did some research, looked at a bunch of different type of thin rip jigs, and you can find your own too. And I'll show you why I think this is the one that I wanted to make and I find the most useful. But again, it's the simplest of all the jigs we're going to make. So I went ahead and did a lot of work here just to get it prepped, so this wouldn't take very long to build. But what you need is a solid piece of wood. I would say a 4x4 would work. I am just using scraps from around the shop, so I didn't have any 4x4s. So I just went ahead and milled down two 2x4s, glued them together, and then milled it down square. So that'll work as well. The length here varies. I would say you just want it at least longer than your blade, maybe not as long as your fence. So I want about half the length of my fence. You have an offcut piece here that we'll use as like another sort of fence. You'll see that. You have the actual piece that you'll use for the thin rip. And then this, even though it looks a bit like the ship that grew flies and Despicable Me, is just a push block, and it's going to sit right on top of our larger block. So you can make this to look however you want. After I made it, this is the first push block I've ever made. So, I just made it with a scrap piece of 2x6 and then a jigsaw. A bandsaw would have worked a lot better. But anyways, after I made it, I thought, well, maybe I would have wanted like a handle similar to what I have here. So I could have just made like a very rudimentary version of this, but I think this will work just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. I've seen some people put like a hole here as well so you can grip it with a finger, but I think there's plenty enough to grab here to just push through. All right, and then you're going to need a 1/4-inch threaded insert and a 1/4-inch, handle knob, whatever you want to call it. So we'll get right into hooking this up, and I'll show you how it works, and then we'll just give you a quick update on our juice groove jig. There we go. Okay, and if you're a regular and you've been watching, you know that our last video that we put out was the creation of this juice groove jig. And after I made the video and put it out, after the whole process, I told you guys that it didn't come out exactly how I would have liked it or imagined it to. And the reason that happened was because I went into it really without a plan, and then all of the build plans, cut list, video, everything like that I edited in post-op gave the correct instructions that I didn't have when building this jig for you to build it on a first time go, right? And I said at the end of the video that I probably would rebuild it, but that this one worked for now. So I've got both in front of me. This is version 1 here and then version 2. So I wasted no time, and I went ahead and I just redid it while it was fresh in my mind, and I had a lot of the scrap left over and things like that. So you can see some differences, but I'll get into them real quick. The first major one is, as I recommended in the video, not to use plywood for the rail guides and to use a hard or even a soft wood. I went with, I think this is pine, so a soft wood worked just fine. And then these are only 1 3/4 inches tall, and I went ahead and went with 2.5 inches here, and I think that's a little bit aggressive. I think you can meet in the middle and go 2 inches and you would be just fine. And I did that just in case I had a board that was like 2 inches thick. You don't want your router base to get caught in the actual slots where the jig slides. So anyways, that's the major difference. And then I followed my cut list that I put out, and everything lined up really well. The second thing I did was I bought the correct threaded inserts, so the 1/4-inch threaded inserts here, and then correct knobs. And so that all combined, this is this 3/4 inch pine here, like it says on the cut list. everything went together fine. I didn't blow out any of the hardwood or the softwood here like I did with the plywood when I tried to put in the threaded inserts. And this one, it works great. No concerns there. Let's see if it'll slide nicely for me once I loosen everything up. It should, that's what everybody likes to say. But I mean, it's good, it's nice, it's square. There we go. And then you can extend it, do whatever you need to do. And I just pop that out. But yeah, and obviously once you've got a board in here that you're sizing it to, it's much easier to size it. And if your board's square and true and everything like that, it'll work just fine. So that looks pretty square to me. And then you just lock it in, tighten a few at a time, kind of like you're putting on or threading a tire, you know what I mean, onto your vehicle. That's not, there we go. It'll square itself up as it tightens. And then there you go. You got yourself your juice groove jig. So I think I've talked about that enough, but just wanted to show you that I did go ahead and remake it, and I'm much happier with this version. So that's scrapped now and will probably be tossed. All right. Okay, so a little bit of a proof of concept here to show you how this works. So this is how you would set up the jig, right? You'd put your reference block against the fence, and you're ripping thin strips. So that's why we have this reference block, so that you're not trying to get a push block in the space where you're trying to cut an 1/8 of an inch piece. You know what I mean? So that's what the reference block is for. And then, so ignore how big this is, and you'll see why it is in a second. But you would put your piece that you're trying to rip a thin strip from directly against your reference block here, and it would cut. Let's see, if I was cutting that big of a thin strip, that's not really a thin strip at this point. It would cut from that stock. If this was, you'll see it. It's hard to explain. So my variation and how I'm putting my own twist on this is I'm taking a bit of a lesson from the juice groove jig, and I don't like making jigs. Let's say I was making a 1/8 inch thin strip. That's about where it would sit, the reference block here, so that as I put my piece against it, it would cut from this piece of stock a 1/8 inch thin strip. That's how this thing works. But this jig would only be good for 1/8 inch thin strips. What if I wanted a 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch and so on, right? So I want this to be adjustable. And I figured I could do that with the star-shaped 1/4 inch knob and then the threaded insert, similar to how I did it with the juice groove jig. So this is where this other reference fence comes in, and you're going to put it in between your fence. And I'm going to join it so that it makes a perfect 90-degree angle. And then when I have it all the way flush against the reference fence, I've got a 3/4 inch thin strip. That's the max that I can rip. I figure anything above 3/4 inch, I could just do as you would any other standard rip. So this will allow me, as I'd like to adjust it, to go all the way. If I push this to 1/8 inch, and our reference fence will slide back. I don't know why I'm trying to finesse it so much. Anyways, our reference fence will slide back, make contact with the fence itself, and now I can rip the 1/8 inch thin strip. And then if I'd like to go a little bit more, just push it over, and there we go. Now it's adjustable. So that shows you kind of how it works as I move the fence there with the push block sitting on top. So the first thing we need to do is, I believe, the order of operations is pretty important here. So let me think about it. I'll be right back. Okay, so I've decided what I want to do first, and the first thing I want to do is get this joined together, right, in that perfect 90-degree angle. So there's so many ways to do this. You could just very simply do it just like this. Just make the end grain meet the face grain here, and then get it into a 90-degree with a triangle, a clamp, whatever, and then screw it together, glue it together, brad nail together, your total preference here. I'm going to take this opportunity to practice a little bit of joinery and cut a rabbet so that it joins together about halfway into this one piece of reference block, and then it'll slide in and it'll look like that. And if you can picture that in your mind, great. If not, let's go ahead and do it. We're going to get on the router table. Okay, so this is a great use of our coping sled, which I'll link to the description. This thing is super helpful when cutting pieces not lengthwise but widthwise, sort of like what a crosscut sled does for a table saw. Just because as you would be pushing this through without the coping sled, there's no real good way to keep it square against the fence, especially when you get into the bit section, and you don't want that piece to slide out on you and bring your fingers close to the bit or whatever. So this keeps you perfectly safe and keeps the piece perfectly square. Now you're going to see a lot of dust come up because this 3/4 inch bit is a little bit too wide for my coping sled, so it's going to cut into the MDF here, but that's totally fine. It's no big deal. So I've gone ahead and set this all up. Got my 3/4 inch bit, straight bit raised to about a 1/4 inch. We're going to get 1/4 inch passes at a time. This is a good first test piece too, just to make sure that the joint is going to be accurate. And yeah, so we'll just go ahead and jump right on that. All right, so the joint is done. Came out pretty square, I think. I'm just going to use my jig to make sure it lines up well. So you see the rabbit right there and it fits in. So I'm going to square everything up and then use the jig itself with some clamps to glue it together square. All right, so now that we've got this glued up, and you saw me went ahead and I countersunk two number 6 screws, about 1 inch long, just into that piece, just to aid in the process of quickening this up and making sure that's in there good. So we got it all square. Now I marked 1/8, which is the smallest thin strip I'll want to make, and I set the reference fence here to match up with that cut line so that the overhang is 1/8 of an inch. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bore in a 1/4 inch hole, and I can scoot this out to do so. Let me go ahead and clamp that down so that it doesn't slip on me. Actually, I'm just going to hold it. So countersink a 1/4 inch bolt there, and that'll be essentially the farthest this way that this can slide once I'm complete with that, and then we'll do the next piece. You won't be able to see because I've got the clamp in the way, but I snugged my reference fence up against the other reference fence. Got 2 reference fences here, so that now if I measure it, if I can, yeah, we can do it. We've got about a 1/2 inch, and that's a little bit more than a 1/2 inch, it looks like. That's the widest, no, it's about a 1/2 inch. Widest thin strip we'll cut with this is a 1/2 inch. Okay, yeah, so I only need 1 hole here. So when it's at its max, it'll be 1/8, and then when I want to slide it, I'm going to route it going this way, so we'll make that mark. Got my pencil, just so we know which way we're routing. So when it slides and it's snug against the 1/4 inch turn, will be like right here. All right, let's go ahead and route this out. There can be some debate later on whether or not I should have done this step first, figuring out the order of operations as I go. So I set my 1/4 inch straight bit to the right height, and then I just lined up my 1/4 inch bored out hole where it kind of catches it. This is kind of tough. There we go, right there. And I'll just drop it on and then push. So let's see how that goes. All right, so I'm pretty new to router tables, but learn from me. Do as I say, not as I do. So you can see super nasty cut here, and that's because as soon as I got into the section with no fence, and this is such a short piece, it turned into the bit and then just screwed it all up. So luckily that was a shallow pass, so we can fix it up as we go through the deeper passes here. But I just took a piece of reference wood that I know is square, and I set it there to act as a temporary fence. So we'll give that another shot. We'll raise the bit and then go from there. we bored out our hole with the 3/8 inch drill bit for these half or 1/4 inch threaded inserts. And then we'll just twist this guy into place. Harder to do it one-handed than it looks. We'll see how well this all lines up. I definitely should have caught that router issue sooner, and then I didn't even lock the fence in place when I went to route it after I put the temporary or the reference fence in. So some amateur mistakes here, but you know, it's a learning process. So definitely countersink this in so it sits flush at a minimum, maybe a little further in there. That way it doesn't impede the squareness of your fence. Throw that in there. Well, there you go. All right, then we want it to be 3/8. Write that in there. Not great there. Okay, so what you're not getting to see here, because the clip that I had recorded became corrupted, essentially this reference block and temporary fence right 90-degree angle was not square. So I went back to the beginning, remade the reference block and temporary fence so that it was 90 degrees and square, and that took all of the error out of the fence. All right, now like with any good woodworking video, especially one that's been kind of as disjointed as this one, we all want a proof of concept, right? We want to show that it works. So we're going to go ahead and try to rip our first thin strip ever. So I've gone ahead and set it to a width of 1/4 inch. I think that's with what I'm comfortable with doing first, just to test it out. So I moved my reference block over to 1/4 inch, and then you set the end of the reference block right against the blade. Lock your table saw fence in place, slide it back, and then you're going to add the piece that you're going to rip in between. And then we're just going to walk her through. So time to see if this works. All right, well, a little bit of cleaning up to do. Got some saw blade marks here. If you had a drub sander, you could clean this up real easily and make it perfectly 1/4 inch. This is pretty close, and I don't think the exact measurement is too important. If you're going for a real accurate thing, then yeah, you definitely want a drub sander to send this through to make it completely square. It's a little bit thinner up towards the top here, so it's a little tapered than it is back here. And then you kind of saw my big issue of not having a way to keep the piece down as it rides through the blade so it wants to lift up. So I think in the future, what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do it today just because I want to move on to other things, and I don't intend on using this necessarily right away, but if you're making this to use it right away, I would, and I can already kind of see why it's a little tapered. It's not exactly... Well, it's pretty close. Anyways, add another slotted block up here, so that when it's you add your knob up here, and then that way, as you fit your stock in, let's slide this back in. As you fit your stock in, you set your stop block right here. Make sure you can see that. Yep, you can see it just fine. Set it right here, tighten the knob, and then that'll keep your piece down as it goes through, and it should help to flush things up real well. So that's my suggestion, and that's something that I'll do as well. Like I said, I'm just not going to do it today, but I'll keep these together so that I have it when I'm ready to do it. And I'll just mention, because someone in the comments inevitably will, to make thin strips on a table saw instead of a bandsaw, you definitely want a zero tolerance blade. The throat plate, that's what it's called, the throat plate. Zero tolerance throat plate, so that as you're cutting stock, and this one I wasn't too worried about being a quarter of an inch, but any thinner and it definitely would have been an issue. Your piece doesn't slide into the throat plate. So there are some easy ways to get around this. You can buy one from Etsy. Lots of people make them for pretty much any brand of table saw. But you can also just take a piece of tape, like frog tape, lay it over your throat plate once the blade is all the way down, turn the blade on, and then rise it up, kind of like we did when we made our crosscut sled. So it cuts through the frog tape, and then you've got yourself a temporary zero tolerance throat plate. So that's my suggestion. But yeah, this is my thin strip jig, guys. Hopefully you liked it. It's a little bit of a spin on one that I saw on YouTube, and I'll link the original video in the channel description, or not the channel, the video description here, and you can go from there. But I hope you guys liked it. As always, like, subscribe, and comment for more. We got a cool project coming up next.